Thanks for joining us again. Just to reiterate that we're starting with timber framing from its inception of felling trees and everything that happens to a house to the end finished product. Hauling to the site. Colonial records make very little mention of loading of timber at the assembly or skid yard. Therefore, the last hitch in the haul to the building site with the two sleds or the timber wagon is conjectural, but probably went like this. The hewn timbers were moved down the parallel logs of the skid by way with a ring dog. It was a cast hook or a log hook and a crowbar attached. For longer, heavier hauls, the four-wheel wagons came into its own. 2 to 5 horses would be needed, while 6 to 10 oxen would bend their backs for wagons, of course. Dry, hard, and reasonably passable roads are a must. So we'll talk horses or oxen, which was the better choice for the home builder or the carpenter, the joiner. The secret to hauling heavy timber was a slow and steady pace, and this for the oxen had no equal. Horses were certainly more agile and faster, but tired quite sooner. Being more high-strung, they could be skittish when the going was difficult. They had to be draped in a relatively costly harness. Somewhat finicky appetites also called for feeding 3 times a day. Not so with the oxen, for they were docile, even-tempered, and certainly strong enough to plod up steep slopes with little effort. A castrated bull, facing hard labor as an ox, may be little cheered by his newfound qualities. Their large hoofs could take the wagon through muck and mire, where horses would soon get bogged down. Oxen were satisfied with a single meal of coarse feed, and their yoke harness was easily shaped from the wood that was at hand, or remnants of the wood that they were actually hauling. Further, only one teamster was needed to manage a team of 8 to 10 oxen, while no more than 4 to 5 horses could be worked by any one person at a time. It was little wonder that the colonists had a high regard for these great lumbering beasts. Seasoning of the wood. That seasoning, drying the wood, the same thing. Once the hewn timber had arrived at the building site, it was stacked in a shady spot, each separated by a thin strip. Slow, uniform drying was a must, since up to 2/3 of the weight of fresh wood is attributed to water. The swollen cells cut with far greater ease when green than after losing their moisture. Doubters should try splitting a few chunks of firewood that are green, and then a few seasoned. A freshly cut piece will slice open like a ripe pumpkin, while a dried one will often fight you back and fight you back. Only when that wood has lost about 5/6 of its water by weight will it be strong enough and stiff enough to support a part of the framing. The rule of thumb, then, was to work the timber when green and put it to the use when it was dried. Annual growth rings shrink during the drying process. Those close to the outer surface will contact before the near to the center if the sun or warm weather is excessive. As the moisture evaporates and the outer rings pull apart, checks and cracks will result. Hopefully, slow drying after the winter felling will allow easy cutting of the mortises and tenons without much checking occurring during the process. Since each mortise hole would shrink slightly with seasoning, it was worthwhile to make the tenons slightly shorter to prevent its being pushed out or being pushed back as the mortise actually dried out. The builder would also be well advised to cut a supporting shoulder to foresee any shortening of a horizontal beam and its tenons as it dried. Before the cutting of the mortises and tenons could begin, each timber must have a final checking for problem spots such as knots, checks, and splits, insect damage, or any grain that wandered badly from the horizontal. After plotting the best placement for the connecting joints, the timber was sawn to the final length. Tools for building. The sawing horse. To bring the timber up to a workable height, 2 sawing stools were used to raise the work to the carpenter's knees. Carpenter's saw can either be considered a framed bow saw or a crosscut saw. To cut hewn timber into proper framing lengths, this rugged, inflexible blade of the framed bow crosscut saw was the saw of choice. The saw set. Sawings would be a frustrating chore without the modest saw set. To prevent the saw blade from binding in a cut, each alternating tooth was set or bent outwards on opposite sides. The splayed teeth therefore cut a wider track than the width of the blade itself. Scribing the joints. When 2 or more timbers were locked together, a joint was formed. Perfectly done, each joint was as though the living trees had grown together to form a strong and enduring house frame. Joinery was reserved for the seasoned, wood-wise craftsman, who took real pride in his dexterous skills. The hurried and often slapdash construction of today would have no place in his scheme of building. That included the permanent jointing of more than 200 massive timbers in the average colonial home, with more than twice that number of joints performed. Mortising gauge. A mortising gauge marks ruled off on the variety of jointings, and the most usual of these were the mortise and tenon. To prevent weakening of posts and beams, the width of each mortise slot and its insertion tenon was generally between 1/3 and 1/2 of the width of the timber. Timber scribe. Each tenon must fit precisely into its own mortise. To be certain that each joint would be a good marriage of the proper partner, every matched pair must be marked with the same number. The timber scribe could cut these numbers to a depth that would remain crisp and clear until the timbers were then joined. Tricks of the trade. The outside faces of the completed framework must be flush to receive the exterior wallboards, since hewn posts were not generally of the same cross-sectional size as to the beam to be joined. Centering a mortise and tenon would not give a continuous outside plane. Therefore, the old timbers scribed their measured gauge markings from the timber side that would be face down from the framework. The colonial carpenter was mindful of the shrinkage of his timber and that was still in the process of seasoning. As it continued to dry, the mortise hole would continue to contract across the grain. The tenon would lose little length with the grain from lost moisture. It was prudent to scribe the tenon a bit shorter, say 1/8 inch or so, to prevent it from being pushed out of the shortening mortise. Augers. Shaping the timber. Mortise. This T-shaped drill could rid and scribe mortise of its unwanted wood with a series of holes. This was no easy chore, for the carpenter had to use the weight of his body and the strength of his arms to bore these sizable holes. He must be content with the ancient spoon auger and its improved cousin, the shell auger. The early form of the spiral auger took its place in the American toolbox well after the Revolution. Chisels. The augers roughly formed mortises and with its slightly overlapped holes was ready to be pared down to the scribe line. Enter the chisel family. The last word in finishing the joint square and true. A snug joining was the sign of a true craftsman, not the weekend handyman. The firmer chisel, from the French word meaning to form, this all-purpose chisel lives up to its name. The parallel blade was sturdily wrought for use with a mallet, cutting a width of wood from 1/16 to 3 inches. Some blades had bevel edges to clean out corners, such as on some mortise work. Most firmers had a long extension that was embedded into the wood handle. The framing chisel. Here was the chisel for heavy gouging. The long and strong parallel edge blade ranged from 2 to 4 inches in width. Generally, the wood handle was well socketed, the taper to taper, instead of having a blade tang. Overall length about 1.5 feet. Joiner's mortising chisel. The rugged blade was usually thick to permit the heavy levering out of deep shavings from the mortise. Equally sturdy was the tanged oval handle and cross section that could withstand heavy mallet blows. The corner chisel. The 90-degree cutting edge squared out deep mortise corners with greater ease than either the firmer or the mortise chisel. It was socketed with a wooden handle that was entirely wrought with steel to use with the mallet. The slick. This oversized chisel lived up to its name. It's 3 to 4 inches wide and could slick off sheets of wood as easily as paring the skin off a crisp apple. The length, up to 30 inches. Weight and sharpness have great control. When pushed with the hands or shoulders, a mallet will never be used. Mallets. Mallets were wooden hammers. If any wooden-handled tool, such as a chisel, was in want of pounding, the mallet was a must. A metal hammer wouldn't do, because it would soon split the wood handle or make its end mushroom-like. Wood against wood was, and still is, good. It is the rule. Throughout the joining of the frame timbers, large mallets called commanders drove the joints together, and then the smaller mallets struck home the tree nails and locked them in for all time.